Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Arthur Hirsch's book, The French New Left and Intellectual History from Sartre to Gorz. Chapter 2 is titled Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, The Existentialist Challenge. Section 1 is titled Introduction, Sartre's Rise to Prominence. Section 2 is titled Sartre's Existentialist Social Theory. Section 3 is Simone de Beauvoir, titled Simone de Beauvoir, Existentialism and Feminism. Section 4 is titled Le Temps Moderne and Existentialist Politics. Section 5 is titled Sartre and the Origins of the French New Left. Excuse me. It's taking me a second to get to this file. Get through this file to the start that I'm trying to... To the start of the chapter I'm trying to read. Jesus Christ, I can't talk. This is going to be a terrible video. Alright. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, The Existentialist Challenge. Section 1 is titled Introduction, Sartre's Rise to Prominence. In the immediate post-war period, existentialism struck a live nerve in the French public. The collapse of traditional values and the shame of defeat and collaboration augmented by the death-fraught experience of the resistance. That's a good word. Ooh. I'm going to write that one down in my word diary. Death-fraught. If I can get to that too. Jesus Christ. This computer sucks. Poopy. Cool word. Death. Sorry about that. Christ, hopefully things will run smoother from here on out. The collapse of traditional values and the shame of defeat and collaboration, augmented by the death-fraught experience of the resistance, created the circumstances whereby existentialism found a vast audience receptive to its anguished mood. In a world controlled by the vast forces of war, technology, and great power politics, existentialism spoke of the crisis of the individual, the problems of guilt and responsibility, bad faith and authenticity, the individual's confrontation with one's own death and the very meaning of one's life. In short, existentialism spoke of the meaning of human freedom. It affirmed the irreducibility of freedom of the individual to choose a course of action in every situation. When so much else seemed to indicate human reality was determined and unfree, the existentialists stubbornly and tenaciously advanced the view that to be human was to be free. So I guess this is, people would say probably this is what is, I mean this is early existentialism, but to the degree that this has an influence over left politics in general, let's say a lot of people would probably say this is what Althusser was responding to. Any discussion of French existentialism inevitably leads to Jean-Paul Sartre, who lived from 1905 to 1980. For while existentialism was a broad intellectual movement with many different and often conflicting tendencies, Sartre towers above it as the leading and most representative figure of the existentialist left. In fact, Sartre's move in the post-war period from existentialism toward Marxism was the main event in the development of New Left social theory. Sartre came to Marxism slowly and gradually. As a bohemian intellectual, he had an instinctive dislike for capitalist society, which he coupled with an honest sympathy for the poor and downtrodden, the working class. Sartre's experience in the resistance viscerally convinced him that the working class was the only possible vehicle for progressive social change. Thus, Sartre became a supporter and advocate of the working class movement, However, while Sartre supported Marxist politics, Sartre found Marxist philosophy impossible to accept because of the dogmatic direction in which it was developed in the communist movement. Nevertheless, by the 1950s, he came to the position that Marxism indeed is the philosophy of our epoch, a philosophy which is unsurpassable for industrial society. The problem with Marxism is that it has become, quote, arrested in the hands of Stalinist ideologues. Under this tutelage, it succumbed to, quote, a sclerosis, and ceases temporarily to be a living philosophy. They have stifled the dialectical vitality of Marxism with a reductionist mechanistic determinism. And I feel like something that I keep thinking about, at least I'm recording this, or in general for the past few days, is kind of like this distinction between that people often conflate with each other. I think there's an important distinction to be made between Stalinism in the sense of like a dogmatic dialectical materialism in the sense of like Marxist-Leninism, like official Soviet ideology, and Stalinism as like a social system and like a politics and a way of and a kind of like I think at least now is like a paradigm through seeing the 20th century. So someone can be, philosophically anti-Stalinist, but still a Stalinist in other capacities, right? This is why, like, this kind of like this radical like openness of like freedom, the infinite freedom of like human beings, kind of thinking plays very well into like the ultra voluntarism of Chinese Stalinism. So there could be like theoretical disputes amongst people and draw on different sources, right, and still be Stalinist, right? You can be like a Stalinist Christian if you accept the politics and view developments in the USSR in the 1930s as a net positive. So the reason I'm saying that is because I feel like there's a lot of like things about talking about a lot of communist intellectuals who like kind of are more open and flexible to like outside influences, say like structuralism or existentialism, and since those things are don't have a genesis in the traditional Marxist canon or in the or in like the Marxist-Leninist like paradigm, or like the like official Soviet ideology, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean the person who has these kind of like is working, it has a more open mind on the philosophical level, means that they're somehow anti-Stalinist. Anyway, under their tutelage, Marxism has succumbed to a, quote, sclerosis and ceased temporarily to be a living philosophy. They have stifled the dialectical vitality of Marxism with a reductionist mechanistic determinism. Compared to the philosophy of Marxism, existentialism, Sartre was to claim by 1957, is a mere, quote, ideology. However, it is an ideology which can serve an important service to Marxism. With its emphasis on the individual, the particular, and the concrete, and its overriding concern for human freedom, existentialism could help to free Marxism from the sterile abstractness of Stalinism. It could help to unblock or revitalize Marxism. In this chapter, we will trace Sartre's steps from existentialism towards Marxism by examining his theoretical and political confrontation with the Stalinism of the PCF during the period of 1944 to 1956. In the next chapter, we will look closely at his critique de la raison dialectique, 1960, the most ambitious and comprehensive philosophical effort to use existentialism to revitalize Marxism. New section. Sartre always considered himself a man of the left, yet prior to 1940 he took no active part in politics. He went to the 14th of July 1935 Popular Front demonstration in Paris more as an observer than as a participant. He never voted, not even for the Popular Front candidates of 1936. In 1972 he said, quote, "I was absolutely in favor of the Popular Front, but it would never have crossed my mind to vote so as to give my opinion the value of a decision. I remained an individualist drawn to the masses who made the Popular Front, but not realizing that I was one of them and that I must stand by them." End quote. Sartre. While Sartre found fascism repugnant, this did not deter him from living in Nazi Germany for a year to study under Heidegger, or from visiting Mussolini's fascist exposition in Rome in exchange for a reduced-rate train fare that was being offered to guarantee large crowds. Nevertheless, his first literary works reveal his leftist sympathies. Antoine Lecointin's biting sarcasm toward the bourgeoisie and bourgeois morality in his first and most famous novel, Nausea, reveals Sartre's anti-capitalist temperament. In the short story The Wall, 1939, which takes place in a prison cell in the Spanish Civil War, this sympathy for the Republicans is clear, just as his antipathy for anti-Semitism and fascism is eloquently manifested in the short story Child of a Leader. But it was the outbreak of the war and his experience as a prisoner of war that convinced him of the absolute necessity of political action. Quote, "I remained inactive, doing nothing but writing, while in perfect sympathy with the left. I lived through the whole period from 1918 to 1939 as through the dawn of a lasting peace. It took the war to open my eyes. There I was seeing myself as a minute and gleaming atom, and then along came massive forces which took hold of me and flung me onto the battlefront without asking my opinion." End quote. Sartre. Starting to get into the footnotes. Sartre was drafted into the French army in late 1939. His entire unit was captured in June 1940 at the Maginot Line. As a POW, Sartre wrote, produced, and acted in his first resistance play, Bariona, performed in Stalag 12 at Trèves, Christmas 1940. Taking the biblical story of Bariona, Sartre was able to talk to his fellow prisoners about captivity, and through the use of allegory suggest that all hope of resistance was not lost. Sartre was a POW from June 1940 to March 1941. By altering his military papers and demonstrating that he was nearly blind in his right eye, Sartre was able to convince the German authorities that he had never been in the army and had been captured by mistake. He returned to Paris in his teaching position at the Lycée Pasteur. Immediately following his release, he sought out Maurice Merleau-Ponty and attempted to found a resistance group called Socialisme et Liberté. Together with Simone de Beauvoir, they bicycled in and out of unoccupied France, seeking the assistance of such prominent intellectuals as Guide and Marat. I don't know how to say that name. Malraux. You see it all the time. No help was forthcoming and the group folded. It was, however, the first time that Sartre expressed what was to become his lifelong political goal. At this time, the communists were very suspicious about how Sartre obtained his release from the POW camp and branded him a German spy. They refused to have anything to do with him. By 1943, however, the climate had changed. It was pretty clear the Allies would eventually win the war. More and more people joined the various resistance organizations, and the communists, who comprised a significant force in the home resistance, began to pursue a policy of coalition and reconciliation with other anti-fascists. Accordingly, they denied ever having made any accusations against Sartre and invited him to work on the Comité National des Écrivains. It's my best attempt at that. The CNE, which they dominated, a communist. In the same year, Sartre's second and more famous resistance play, The Flies, was produced in Paris. The tale of Oreste, Orestes, returning to avenge the murder of his father, Agamemnon, or maybe it's Ortesis, I don't know. I'm dumb. By killing the tale of Ortesis, returning to avenge the murder of his father, Agamemnon, by killing Aegisthus, the usurper, and his own mother, Clytemnestra, was transformed by Sartre into a thinly veiled allegory of the circumstances of occupied France. He also took the opportunity in this play to dramatize his philosophical views on freedom, guilt, and responsibility, because he accepts the responsibility for his own actions. Orestes is able to overcome the power of guilt and remorse which the flies exercise over the people of Argos. From this acceptance of responsibility, his freedom is born. The play was a great popular success and marked Sartre as the most significant literary resistant. During the occupation years of 1943 to 1944, Sartre continued to teach and pursue his philosophical Being in Nothingness, literary Roads to Freedom trilogy, and dramatic No Exit interests. He continued his resistance activity with the CNE under the direction of the Surrealist PCF member Paul Eluard, worked on the clandestine communist journal Les Lettres Françaises, and wrote articles for Albert Camus' underground paper Combat. There's like a whole thing about like the different political strains in like surrealism, right? The initiator of surrealism, André Breton, was a communist and a Trotskyist, and then I believe an anarchist. Moving on. Sartre's stature as a major intellectual figure on the French scene dates from the liberation period of 1944 to 1946. In the first 2 years of the peace in Paris, 4 of his plays were performed, 2 of his novels published. Being in Nothingness was widely circulated. The Temps moderne was launched. His services as a journalist were in demand by several major newspapers, and his popularity as a public speaker was increasing. Existentialism was all the vogue in Paris, and as its chief exponent, Sartre gained fame far and wide. Section 2. Sartre's Existentialist Social Theory. The subtitle of Being in Nothingness, an essay in phenomenological ontology, indicates Sartre's intellectual debt to the German thinkers Husserl and Heidegger. From Husserl, Sartre took the phenomenological method of analyzing the objects of consciousness as they appear for consciousness. From Heidegger, Sartre took the ontological concern for the individual's relationship to being. Sartre interpreted Husserl and Heidegger through the Cartesian lenses of rationalism he acquired at the École Normale. Thus, his social theory remains situated in the individualist problematic. The social theory that emerges from Sartre's early philosophical magnum opus, Being in Nothingness, of 1943, appears quite contradictory, for on the one hand there is the optimistic assertion that one is unconditionally free. Quote, human freedom precedes essence in man and makes it possible. The essence of human being is suspended in his freedom. What we call freedom is impossible to distinguish from the being of, quote, human reality. Man does not exist first in order to be free subsequently. There is no difference between the being of man and his being free. End quote. Sartre. On the other hand, we find the pessimistic assertion that the individual constantly flees from freedom into bad faith, that one's attempts to live and act authentically are doomed to failure. In short, quote, man is a useless passion, quote. The assertion of radical freedom in the first half of this dichotomy proved to be the basis of his eventual contribution to New Left social theory. Moreover, the individualist basis of this social theory and its ahistorical tragic sense of despair led French Marxists to believe that existentialism represented a refurbishing of conservative idealist social theory under a leftist mask. They drew this conclusion because existentialist despair appeared to imply that social activism was futile. In the debate that ensued between the existentialist Sartre and the traditional Marxist, an important theoretical transformation evolved. Sartre, without renouncing his conception of the fundamental irreducibility of individual freedom, came to accept step by step the historical and social dimensions conditioning it. This is evident in his Critique de la raison dialectique of 1960. For their part, some of the Marxists came to recognize the, quote, existential dimension of historical and social reality, and on this basis made their own contribution to the development of New Left theory. The social theory of the book, Being and Nothingness, centers on the question, what is the subject's relationship to the world? In answering this question, Sartre rejects classical metaphysics and idealism while retaining the primacy of consciousness. Still, the Cartesian cogito is accepted as the starting point, but its implication is reversed. For consciousness is experienced as a lack. It is always consciousness of something other than consciousness. The very fact of consciousness implies otherness, implies the being of the world without the Cartesian resort to a divine cause. Therefore, the individual is not related to the world at all, as classical metaphysics frame the question. Rather, consciousness reveals the being of the world because it is in the world. Consciousness reveals the being of the world because consciousness is in the world. The subject-world relation hence is internal. Subject in the world is a synthetic unity. The existentialist view of the subject is thus a move away from traditional French idealism with its abstract view of the individual as a more or less spiritual essence divorced from concrete determinations. However, in Being and Nothingness, Sartre stops short of materialism, for while human being in the world is a synthetic unity, human reality is nevertheless fragmented and bipolar. Its fundamental ontological structure is dyadic, for itself and in itself. For itself is consciousness, in itself is materiality. The fullness of being is characteristic of the in itself, in its solidity and mass, while the for itself is a translucent negativity, is nothingness. Existentialist freedom and authenticity consists of the effort of the for itself, consciousness, to transcend, go beyond the materiality of the in itself. Bad faith, on the other hand, is the surrender of the for itself to the inertness and opacity of the in itself. It is the acceptance of object status by a subject. It is from this distinction between freedom and bad faith that the political radicalism of existentialist social theory derives. For on the social level, a positive existentialist value, meaning acting authentically, and implies the necessity of engagement, commitment, and progressive social change, while bad faith, a negative existentialist value, implies acceptance of the status quo. At the same time, Sartre maintains such an overwhelming negative view of social relations as to cast doubt on the progressive character of his early social thought. For the other is experienced primarily as a threat to my freedom. The existence of the other, of a whole world of others, is a limitation on my absolute freedom. Sartre's view of social relations in the book Being and Nothingness is very close to the Hobbesian view of the war of each against all. The encounter with the other is fraught with all sorts of danger. For through the, quote, look, the other may attempt to reduce me to an object, reduce me to shame. Contact with the other is strained and uncomfortable. He or she may attempt to steal my freedom from me, and so I must be on my guard. Even friendship and love carry the threat of loss of freedom. Thus, all social relations are essentially relations of conflict. This view denies the existence or even the possibility of healthy social relations characterized by trust and cooperation. In short, quote, hell is other people. This slogan from the play, No Exit, pithily summarizes Sartre's early view of social relations. Here, then, are the main contradictions of Sartre's early existentialist social theory. Human being is unconditionally free and a useless passion. Existentialism exalts the dignity and humanity of the human spirit, and yet hell is other people. At the time of the liberation, Sartre tried to play down the pessimistic and gloomy side of existentialism and portray it as a, quote, optimism, a, quote, humanist philosophy of action, of effort, of combat, of solidarity, end quote. Sartre stressed the similarities between his thought Sartre stressed the similarities between his thought and Marxism, claiming both were compatible philosophies of freedom and action. Existentialism was not the product of defeat and despair, rather it developed in the revolutionary climate of the resistance. At first, the communist intellectuals appeared receptive to this view. When Sartre claimed, quote, "We were never more free than under the German occupation," end quote, many of the communist intellectuals who had risked their lives by participating in the resistance understood, quote, "The choice that each of us made of himself was authentic because it was made in the presence of death. ... The question of freedom was posed, and we were brought to the edge of the deepest knowledge a man can have of himself," end quote. Sartre. After the liberation, however, the resistance gradually began to fade. The PCF was now close to power, a party pulsing with an overconfident, enthusiastic optimism. Party leaders found something pernicious in the despair and anguish of Sartre's existentialism. They called it a bourgeois ideology of nihilism, decadence, and anti-humanism. Also, the party was wary of losing some of its mass following to existentialism, for the youth of France was flocking to it. Even many of the younger communist intellectuals were attracted to Sartre's thought, provoking a sharp split within the party itself. Thus, a strong Marxist rebuttal became urgently needed. Henri Lefebvre led the attack. In response to Sartre's mise au point in the journal, or mise au point, I don't know how to say it, it says MISE space AU space POINT. Henri Lefebvre led the attack in response to Sartre's mise au point in action. Lefebvre claimed existentialism had nothing at all in common with Marxism. The tone of the article was quite combative, for while he no longer charged Sartre, quote, with having been a disciple of the Nazi Heidegger, end quote, he still considered him a subjective idealist and a, quote, munitions maker against Marxism, end quote. Henri Lefebvre. One second. Lefebvre also wrote the first book-length critique of being and nothingness. In his book, L'existentialisme of 1946, he claimed to uncover the social origins of existentialism and, quote, the moral decomposition of the so-called higher classes, end quote. Lefebvre. Sartre was a spokesman for a decadent class bordering on neurosis and irrationalism. Quote, in the queer existence described by Sartre, anxiety, vertigo, fascination, and need to destroy, etc., become sources of truth. Philosophically, Sartre failed to overcome the dualism of idealism and materialism. For Lefebvre, the basic difference between Marxism and existentialism was revealed in Sartre's romantic, irrationalist attitude towards science. Quote, the essential difference between dialectical materialism and existentialism resides in the attitude towards science. ... Dialectical materialism saves reason because it makes it concrete without suppressing it. ... It integrates the irrational within reason, end quote. Sartre. Existentialism, on the contrary, attempts to interweave reason with the irrational. Its basic concepts are, quote, magical, novelistic images lacking logical rigor or consistency. In fact, quote, there is a morbidity, a neurotic element in it with infantile regression, end quote. Wait, did I say Sartre before? I think I might have just said the Sartre. Let me repeat something. For Lefebvre, the basic difference between Marxism and existentialism was revealed in Sartre's romantic irrationalist attitude towards science. Quote, the essential difference between dialectical materialism and existentialism resides in the attitude towards science. Dialectical materialism saves reason because dialectical materialism makes reason concrete without suppressing reason. Dialectical materialism integrates the irrational within reason. End quote. Lefebvre. Existentialism, on the contrary, attempts to interweave reason with the irrational. Its basic concepts are, quote, magical, novelistic images lacking logical rigor or consistency. In fact, quote, there is morbidity, a neurotic element in it with infantile regression, end quote. Lefebvre. Other Marxist critiques of existentialism soon followed and were no less insulting. Roger Garaudy, important Communist Party intellectual, future Holocaust denier, another leading communist philosopher claimed, quote, every class has the literature it deserves. The upper bourgeoisie in decay delights in the erotic obsessions of a Henry Miller or the intellectual fornications of Jean-Paul Sartre. And Jean Canapa, a communist former student of Sartre's, wrote a personal attack decrying the, quote, degeneracy and, quote, perversion of the existentialist, quote, cafe revolutionaries, end quote. Amid all this rancor, some solid points were raised. Sartre had not escaped the individualist problematic. Sartre's critique of idealism was a step in the right direction as far as the Marxists were concerned, but because he failed to embrace materialism, Sartre became hopelessly mired in a murky netherworld between idealism and materialism. The fact that he could not adequately account for the intersubjectivity of social relations, except through the, quote, magic of the look, end quote, stemmed from these weaknesses. Sartre responded to these polemics with a lecture in 1945 called Existentialism is a Humanism, and an article in Le Temps Moderne in 1946, Materialism and Revolution. In the lecture he gave in October 1945, he denied the charges against him. Existentialism, he said, is not, quote, an invitation to people to dwell in the quietism of despair, end quote. Existentialism is not, quote, gloomy. Rather, it is a philosophy of action. It is an attempt to look reality in the face, accept the tragic character of human existence, and forge ahead into engagement and social commitment. In response to charges that his existentialism fosters amoral nihilism, Sartre denied that the maxim, quote, everyone can do what he likes, end quote, follows from his thought. Instead, he argued that existentialism is a humanism that demands a Kantian-esque universalization of one's values. Thus, quote, in committing myself, I also commit the whole of humanity, end quote, Sartre. On the other hand, the individual alone is free to create one's existence, one's essence, by the actions one performs. Existential humanism requires action that is both universal and free. It is the only philosophy, Sartre claimed, that is suitable for revolutionary politics. This defense of existentialism was unconvincing to the Marxists because it was still rooted in the individualist problematic. Sartre would not join a revolutionary group where he would have to, quote, count on men whom I do not know, end quote. His individual freedom could be preserved only, quote, in the unity of a party or group which I can more or less control, end quote. This was justified in Sartre's eyes because Cartesian subjectivity was his point of departure. Yet Sartre could not demonstrate any rational connection between his concept of individual freedom and collective action. It appears that a metaphysical leap of faith was the only connection between his existential philosophy and his leftist politics. In his essay titled Materialism and Revolution, Sartre turned this charge around and attacked the Stalinists for making such a leap of faith themselves into materialism. To Sartre, materialism was a, quote, doctrine that destroys thought, end quote, that attempts to, quote, reduce the action of mind to that of matter, to eliminate subjectivity by reducing the world and the individual to a system of objects linked together by universal relationships, end quote. It was such a monstrous doctrine that it could only be accepted on faith as a useful myth of furthering revolutionary politics. Yet the Marxists demanded that it be accepted not as myth but as truth. In one very clear passage, Sartre went to the heart of the practical difference between his existentialism and Marxist materialism. Quote, I know that man has no salvation other than the liberation of the working class. I know this before being a materialist. I know this before being a materialist, and from a plain inspection of the facts. I know that our intellectual interests lie with the proletariat. Is that a reason for me to demand of my thinking, which has led me to this point, that it destroy itself? Is that a reason for me to force it to henceforth to abandon its criteria, to think in contradictions, to be torn between incompatible theses, so lose even the clear consciousness of faith, to launch forth blindly in a giddy flight that leads to faith? End quote. Sartre. Sartre also presented a telling critique of the materialist view of subjectivity. Stalinism, Sartre claimed, did not have a valid theory of subjectivity and consequently was inadequate for a social theory. For objective conditions of hunger and exploitation did not create revolutions in the same manner that heat makes water boil. Revolutionaries are not passively experienced as the result of objective factors. Revolutions are not passively experienced as the result of objective factors. Rather, revolutions are actively initiated by individuals of free minds and free wills. Since Stalinist materialism denies the importance of such individual freedom, it blocks the path to revolution. This last charge infuriated the communists, and yet they could not refute it, for they could not explain in individual cases why some people became revolutionaries and others did not. Nor could they explain, except in the most general sense, why revolutionary consciousness developed in certain historical situations and not in other similar situations. Sartre had uncovered a serious weakness in Marxism. This lack of concrete theory of consciousness and of the individual was the weak point in Marxism at which Sartre hammered away again and again. In his 1946 article, he presented many arguments which the materialists couldn't answer, while qualifying the more unguarded claims about human freedom he made in the book Being and Nothingness, and the essay, or the lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism of 1945. Limitations on the absolute freedom of the individual were now recognized in the, quote, plurality of freedoms, end quote. Quote, a revolutionary philosophy ought to account for the plurality of freedoms and show how each freedom can be an object for the other while being at the same time a freedom for itself. Only this double character of freedom and objectivity can explain the complex notions of oppression, conflict, failure, and violence, end quote. Sartre. For the first time, Sartre had begun to grapple with Marxism on a serious level. The issues and themes raised in the article Materialism and Revolution proved to be the kernel of the social theory he eventually elaborated in his Critique of Dialectical Reason. Thus, the debate of existentialism with Marxism in post-1945 France required Sartre to assimilate Marxism and led Sartre to attempt to transform it by incorporating his existentialism within it. While this effort was rejected by orthodox Marxists, it proved to be essential to the new left social theory that emerged in the 1960s. Section 3. Simone de Beauvoir, Existentialism and Feminism. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre is concerned with the existential relation man in the world, while in the second sex, Simone de Beauvoir is concerned with that of woman in the world. Indeed, her encyclopedic, groundbreaking study of the oppression of women is firmly rooted in existentialist social theory. This is reflected in the two main theses of the book. One, that man, in pursuit of recognition of himself as subject, has transformed woman into the other, as a dependent and inessential being. And two, that such a status for women is not inherent in her nature, but is a product of historical development and thus subject to change. The concept of woman as the other is the central thesis of de Beauvoir's study. In fact, she considered calling the book The Other or The Other Sex before finally settling on her title. Quote, the category of the other, end quote, de Beauvoir tells us, quote, is as primordial as consciousness itself. ... It is a fundamental category of human thought, end quote. As we saw with Sartre, the world is revealed to consciousness as otherness, and the other is always a threat to the subject. This threat derives from the fact that the other may deny recognition of my subjectivity and view me as an object, may attempt to deny my freedom while acting out his own. Following Hegel's analysis of the master-slave relationship, de Beauvoir claims, quote, we find in consciousness itself a fundamental hostility toward every other consciousness. The subject can be posed only in being opposed. He sets himself up as the essential as opposed to the other, the inessential, the object, end quote. De Beauvoir. Thus far, de Beauvoir's view of social relations accords with Sartre's. Unlike Sartre, however, de Beauvoir recognizes historical and social constraints on the freedom of the subject to pursue self-realization. In particular, she points out the constraints on women. Quote, men compel her to assume the status of the other, end quote. Man is the subject, man is the absolute, she is the other. The second sex examines from an existentialist perspective why and how man forced this role on women, and explains how she can escape it and assert her freedom as subject. Throughout the ages, the commonly accepted view was that the inequality of the sexes was not man-made, but rather a fact of nature, of biology. The elemental realities of human reproduction and the general disparity of muscular strength between men and women created what appeared in pre-literate and traditional societies to be a natural division of labor between the sexes. Menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth were involuntary natural functions which women could not escape or control. Thus, the limitations on woman's freedom appeared to be created by nature, not by man. De Beauvoir takes seriously the impact of biology on woman's condition. Yet she argues that biology alone is not sufficient to explain woman's lot. It is not the biological and anatomical differences themselves that give rise to inequality. Rather, it is the social meaning, the values assigned to such differences that are the sources of inequality. The question then is, where do such values come from? Freud claimed that they come from within the human psyche, from within consciousness. Freud claimed that they come from within the human psyche, from within the unconscious, and that sexuality alone is the basis for understanding human conduct. Consequently, woman's condition is comprehensible from the psychoanalytic concept of the electric complex, a conflict between her masculine and feminine tendencies expressed in the differences between clitoral and vaginal eroticism. Although de Beauvoir gives Freud credit for establishing certain basic sexual phenomena, de Beauvoir rejects the psychoanalytic view of woman as monocausal and deterministic. It is monocausal in that it reduces woman to her sexuality, which de Beauvoir sees as only one, though obviously a significant, aspect of woman's being. And is deterministic in that it explains woman's adult behavior as a result of early childhood experience. Thereby denying the reality of choice. The basis of the existentialist concept of freedom. Finally, de Beauvoir sees in psychoanalysis a denial of woman's humanity. Quote, among psychoanalysts, she claims, quote, man is defined as a human being and woman as a female. Whenever she behaves as a human being, she is said to imitate the male, end quote. De Beauvoir. In opposition to the psychoanalytic view of woman as torn between masculine and feminine tendencies, Beauvoir offers the existentialist view of woman, torn between accepting the role of object, the other, or asserting her freedom as subject. In order to achieve the latter, she must establish her own values in the world. Traditional Marxism also provides an explanation for the origins of inequality between the sexes. In the book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels laid the foundation for the Marxist view of the oppression of woman in terms of changes in the mode of production. Based on an evaluation of 19th century knowledge of anthropology, archaeology, and ancient history, Engels speculated on the nature of prehistoric society. Engels hypothesized the existence of a primitive communist society with a subsistence economy. While there was a division of labor between the sexes, equality nevertheless prevailed because women performed important agricultural activities. But the invention of the bronze tool, which was too heavy for women to wield, allowed primitive man to increase his productivity and create a surplus beyond subsistence needs. This technological revolution simultaneously displaced women in production and laid the foundation for the institution of private property. It resulted in change in the mode of production from primitive communism, where land was owned in common by all members of the clan, to slavery, where man appropriated the surplus produced by his fellow man as his own private property. Woman lost her role in production and became a dependent and inessential being. Engels concluded that woman's oppression was caused by the creation of private property. Woman could be emancipated, he argued, only by the abolition of private property and her return to social production alongside man. De Beauvoir agrees with much of Engels' speculations as well as his conviction that woman could be emancipated in a socialist society. Nevertheless, she also had serious reservations about his analysis. De Beauvoir doesn't really explain why the appearance of a social surplus should lead to the institution of private property, nor why the latter must... I'm going to read this. De Beauvoir disagrees with much of Engels' speculations as well as his conviction that women could be emancipated in a socialist society. Nevertheless, de Beauvoir also has serious reservations about Engels' analysis. Engels doesn't really explain why the appearance of a social surplus should lead to the institution of private property, or why private property must inevitably lead to the oppression of woman. Further, she objects to his, quote, economic monism, end quote, and claims that, quote, to reduce the antagonism of the sexes to class conflict, is simply untenable. Woman cannot in good faith be regarded simply as a worker, end quote. De Beauvoir. Finally, de Beauvoir notes that while the ideal of a truly socialist society is consistent with the emancipation Finally, de Beauvoir notes that while the ideal of a truly socialist society is consistent with the emancipation of women, the practice of the Soviet Union has been to revive the, quote, ancient patriarchal restraints, and, quote, on women as well as, quote, paternalistic concepts of marriage, end quote. De Beauvoir. Thus, in seeking to account for the oppression of women and the inequality of the sexes, de Beauvoir finds the biological, psychoanalytic, and Marxist explanations inadequate. What is missing in each of them is a view of woman, quote, as a human being in quest of values in a world of values, end quote. Only the existentialist perspective speaks to this fundamental point, for it views the individual as free to create oneself by creating values in the world. Like Sartre, de Beauvoir affirms the plasticity of human nature. Both claim there is no fixed human essence because human existence precedes existence. Thus, de Beauvoir argues that there is no such thing as a feminine nature as the biological and psychoanalytic perspectives maintain. What is assumed to be feminine nature is actually a social construction, not a fixed essence. Hence her famous claim, quote, one is not born but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces the creature, end quote. De Beauvoir. Woman as the other is a product of society. More specifically, she is the product of male-dominated society. With the invention of the bronze tool, man was able to use his superior physical strength to clear forests, cultivate fields. He acted independently to transform nature, to transcend the givens of the world as he found it, often risking his life in the process. In pursuing such projects, man achieved a certain self-realization. Man was the subject of his projects. His actions were essential to their success. Woman, however, did not participate in his efforts of transcendence. Woman was not essential to them. Woman was not active in them. Woman was dependent on him. Instead of pursuing projects of transcendence, woman was caught up in the immanence of her biological functions, of pregnancy and childbirth. Woman was caught up in the doing of monotonous, repetitive household tasks. Thus man became the subject and she his other. Quote, a woman keeps busy, but she doesn't do anything. She is not recognized as an individual through her functions as a wife, mother, housekeeper. The reality of man is in the houses he builds, the forests he clears, the sick people he cures. But a woman unable to fulfill herself through projects and goals is forced to find her reality in the immanence of her person. End quote. De Beauvoir. To liberate herself, then, woman must pursue her own projects of transcendence. She must seek economic independence. Further, such independence is possible only if woman's biological functions are consciously regulated via birth control methods. Such is the existentialist foundation of de Beauvoir's view of the oppression of women. From this perspective, she conducts an exhaustive analysis of woman's experience ranging over the fields of history, sociology, anthropology, literary criticism, and comparative anatomy. She examines the life cycle and life changes of woman in intimate detail, as well as the history of women's efforts to change their lot. From housework and childcare to substandard wages to frigidity and lesbianism, she describes the innumerable ways in which women are victims of sexist attitudes and practice. Women are victims of sexist attitudes and practices. When it was published in 1949, The Second Sex was received with shock and outrage and provoked a backlash of sexist vulgarity against the author. Francois Mauriac, the conservative critic, simultaneously condemned the work as pornography and exclaimed in private that, quote, de Beauvoir's vagina has no secrets for me, end quote. Her friend Camus accused de Beauvoir of, quote, making the French male look ridiculous, end quote. The Catholic Church predictably put the book on its index of forbidden reading, while communist critics considered it a misleading diversion from the class struggle and argued that the advent of socialism would eliminate the, quote, woman problem, end quote. In 1949, de Beauvoir agreed that woman's hope for equality ultimately lay with the socialist cause, but the Soviet model was not encouraging, and what was one to do until the revolution? Feminism, of course, was not a new perspective in post-war Europe. Advocates of women's equality and women's rights have existed through the ages. Indeed, a modern tradition of feminism emerged in Europe in the late 18th century and developed in the 19th century in both liberal and socialist directions. The victory of women's suffrage movements, far from political equality, The victory of the women's suffrage movements for formal political equality in the early 20th century culminated in the first great wave of feminism. With the publication of the book The Second Sex in 1949, de Beauvoir both anticipated and helped to lay the foundation for a new wave of feminism that followed in the wake of May 1968, and radically questioned not just political inequality but every aspect of women's oppression. Her book is widely recognized even by critics as, quote, the most important and most forceful vindication of women's rights to have appeared in the 20th century, end quote. Where am I? New section, the Temps moderne and existentialist politics. In October 1945, Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and several others founded the review Le Temps moderne. Throughout the post-war period, it was a beacon of independent, critical leftist social thought. Under Sartre's direction, this journal served as the essential point of reference for non-communist intellectuals of the existentialist left. Almost all of Sartre's important work appeared initially between its covers. During the first 8 years of its existence, Merleau-Ponty was its political editor, and Camus and de Beauvoir regularly wrote articles in a broad range of subjects. The Temps moderne thus proved to be the unofficial theoretical organ of the existentialist, quote, party. In the first issue, Sartre attempted to define the theoretical orientation of the review and consequently the social responsibility of intellectuals. Quote, to sum it up, our intention is to participate in bringing forth certain changes in our society. Without being materialists, we want to side with those who want to change both the social condition of a man and his conception of himself, end quote. To achieve this goal, intellectuals needed a different conception of their own role than the commonly accepted ones. Traditionally, intellectuals regarded abstention from social concerns as the only way of maintaining their intellectual purity. But Sartre argues intellectuals are not above the affairs of society, nor are they members of a quasi-monastic order divorced from temporal considerations. Where the hell am I? Quote, for us, the writer is neither a Vestal nor an Ariel. He is, quote, in the thick of it, end quote. Whatever he does has far-reaching consequences, end quote. Sartre, the intellectual must accept this social responsibility not just as any other private citizen, but as one with greater opportunity to affect public opinion. Quote, the writer is situated in his time. Every word has consequences, every silence too. I hold Flaubert and Goncourt responsible for the repression which followed the Commune, because they did not write one line to prevent it. One might say that it was not their business. But was the Calas trial Voltaire's business? Dreyfus's condemnation of Zola's? The administration of the Congo Guides? Each of these authors, in a special circumstance of his life, measured his responsibility as a writer. The occupation taught us ours, end quote. Sartre. Thus, the intellectual must be engagé, a committed advocate of certain conceptions of the individual. A committed advocate of a certain conception of the individual. The conception to which Le Temps moderne commits itself is, of course, the existentialist view that, quote, the person is nothing else but his freedom, end quote. The general political orientation of the journal emerged as a leftist critique of the quote, resistance betrayed, end quote. For many of the Existentialists expected an apocalyptic socialist revolution to follow the revolution of 1944, the liberation of 1944. When their hopes were shattered by tripartisme, they blamed the PCF for disarming the FFI, resistance guerrilla units, and pursuing the parliamentary legalistic road to power instead of armed revolution. Thus, the journal pursued a double thrust reminiscent of Socialisme et Liberté. As Sartre put it, quote, we must militate in our writings in favor of the freedom of the person and the socialist revolution. It has often been claimed that they are not reconcilable. It is our job to show tirelessly that they imply each other, end quote. Sartre. It was in accordance with this conception of engagement that Sartre participated in 1948 in the founding of the Rassemblement Démocratique Révolutionnaire, RDR. Sartre conceived of the RDR as a movement as opposed to hierarchical political party which would be revolutionary in opposition to the reformism of the mainline socialists and democratic in opposition to the dictatorial thrust of the communists. Its goal was to, quote, rediscover the great democratic revolution of revolutionary socialism, end quote. Sartre envisioned a united democratic and socialist Europe as an intermediary force, a third way between the Cold War superpowers. He also hoped the RDR would provide a practical solution to the theoretical, quote, third way he sought between idealism and materialism, between individual freedom and social responsibility. Quote, the old conflict between individualism and society is one that RDR members take as transcended. Our aim is the integration of the free individual in a society conceived as the unity of the free activities of individuals. End quote. Sartre. The RDR was launched in the early part of 1948 by a group of left-wing journalists from various resistance-inspired newspapers and reviews. Sartre and David Rousset, a former Trotskyist, were its top leaders. In February 1948, a manifesto proclaiming the founding of the RDR was distributed in Paris and published by Combat and France Thiroux. It read in part, quote, "Between the rottenness of capitalist democracy and the weaknesses and flaws of a certain kind of social democracy and the limitations of communism in its Stalinist form, we think that a party of free men is capable of giving new life to the principles of freedom and human dignity by relating them to the struggle for social revolution." End quote. In March, Sartre and Rousset held a press conference and organized a public meeting, attended by 1,000 people, at which Sartre spoke. An organization newspaper, La Gauche, was also launched that month. Sartre and Merleau-Ponty opened the columns of the Temps moderne to the RDR, as did the editors of Combat. Claude Bourdet and Albert Camus, and France Thiroux, George Altman, and Bernard Lefort. Having rejected the Stalinist version of Marxism in the article Materialism and Revolution, Sartre now sets out in RDR to synthesize his existentialism and the Marxism of the Paris Manuscripts with its concept of alienation. Quote, "Man, as Marx said, is in a state of alienation. That is, he does not possess his own destiny, his own life, his own work. The ideas he has are not formed directly by him. We desire concurrently to deliver him on the ideological level of his mystifications that prejudice the democratic exercise of his freedom, and on the social level of all forms of exploitation that make him an alienated man." End quote. Sartre. But a politics devoted to rooting out alienation proved to be premature in the late 1940s. But a politics devoted to rooting out alienation proved to be premature in the late 1940s. It wasn't until the 1960s that a social base for such a new left politics emerged. Because the RDR was conceived of as a loose, quote, gathering instead of disciplined political party, hope for success depended on a mass appeal which never materialized. In practice, the RDR appealed primarily to a few dissident members and factions of other leftist organizations. Aside from the journalists, some left-wing members of the section Française Internationale des Ouvriers, SFIO, joined, as well as some members of the Jeune République, a Christian leftist organization, and Rousset's former Trotskyist followers. Instead of a mass movement, another splinter sect was appended to the French left. However, the RDR was not completely ineffectual. 5,000 people attended an RDR-sponsored, quote, Day of Studies, in which Sartre, Camus, de Beauvoir, André Breton, Richard Wright, and Carlo Levi participated. In January 1949, the RDR's Indochina peace petition was successful in gathering thousands of signatures, showing for the first time that a significant portion of French public opinion opposed the Indochina War. Sartre's relations with the PCF reached an all-time low during his association with the RDR. Not only was Sartre trying to recruit the party membership to another organization, but this occurred at the same time as the first run in Paris of his play, titled Dirty Hands, which the French right adored. The murder in the play of Houderer, the party leader, by a member of a dissident party faction, was interpreted as similar to the crimes imputed to Stalin. In fact, this is not what Sartre intended. Nevertheless, the communists took it as anti-Soviet propaganda. Quote, "For 30 pieces of silver and a mess of American pottage, Jean-Paul Sartre sold out what remained of his honor and probity," end quote, was the opinion of one communist review of the play. The PCF sent militants to picket the theaters when a film version was released. They continually repeated the refrain that Sartre was an intellectual fleek, parenthesis, cop, in parenthesis, and an agent of Wall Street and world capitalism. The successful RDR, quote, Day of Studies, and, quote, they attacked as, quote, an anti-Soviet meeting organized by a clique of intellectuals whose showy generalities and literary slogans scarcely dissimulate a deliberate acceptance of the capitalist regime, end quote. Sartre. It's me. No, I'm not. God, I'm like in the practice of saying Sartre. It's not Sartre. It's a critic of Sartre. In fact, there was a legitimate basis for the PCF hostility to the RDR. Rousseau was moving further and further to the right and taking the organization with him. His pro-Americanism became so pronounced that the U.S. Embassy and the Communist-purged U.S. Labor Federation, CIO, supported and participated in an RDR International Day for Resistance to Dictatorship and War on the 30th of April 1949. Essentially, this was an attempt to upstage and embarrass the annual Communist May Day celebration scheduled for the next day. Sartre opposed this move, and for several months he fought to reverse this trend and preserve RDR's neutralism, but his efforts came to no avail. In October 1949, he officially resigned from the organization, and soon after it collapsed. Sartre later wrote on the RDR's failures, quote, circumstances merely seemed to be favorable to the association. It answered an abstract need defined by the objective situation, but not any real need among the people. Consequently, they did not support it, end quote. Sartre. For Sartre and his fellow existentialists at the Temps moderne, a period of political confusion followed the collapse of the RDR. The revelations concerning the existence of widespread system of forced labor camps in the Soviet Union, followed by the outbreak of the Korean War, pushed Sartre toward political fellow traveling with the PCF. Simone de Beauvoir, in her novel *The Mandarins*, presents a moving fictional account of how the Soviet labor camp issue affected the personal lives and political convictions of those in her milieu. Also, like, this should not have been news. Anyway, in January 1950, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty jointly signed an editorial in the Temps moderne on the Soviet labor camp issue, admitting that it, quote, placed the whole meaning of the Russian system in doubt, end quote. After much soul-searching, however, they decided that the circumstances of the Cold War required support for the Soviet Union. Quote, the USSR is on the whole situated in the balance of powers on the side of those who are struggling against the forms of exploitation known to us. The decadence of Russian communism does not make the class struggle a myth. Quote, free enterprise and, quote, possible or desirable, or the Marxist criticism in general null and void, end quote. Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. But even more than the camps, the Korean War pushed Sartre politically closer to the Communist Party of France. It was true that North Koreans attacked first. The Communists only discredited themselves by lying about this. But in Sartre's view, the attack was a trap set by MacArthur into which the North Korean army fell after being taunted by a series of border provocations. Further, Sartre argued the American troops were ruthlessly murdering Korean peasants and burning their villages and crops. Thus he saw the Korean War in the same way that many people viewed the Vietnam War a generation later, an overwhelming case of racist, almost genocidal aggression by the U.S. government. By 1952, he was ready to ally with the Communist Party of France. The alliance was cemented in the aftermath of the Ridgeway, quote, riots. The PCF organized a militantly provocative demonstration against the U.S. General Ridgeway, who had come to Paris on the 28th of May, 1952, fresh from the Korean War zone. The French government brutally repressed the demonstration, seized the communist newspapers, and raided Communist Party offices throughout the country. French police arrested every party leader they could find, including Jacques Duclos, who as a senator supposedly had parliamentary immunity. Duclos had two dinner squab in his car at the time of his rest and was ludicrously accused of intending to use them as carrier pigeons to send secret communiques to Stalin. The PCF called on the workers to protest in the form of a one-day general strike, which did not materialize. Ignoring the implications of the government's repressive measures, a number of leftist dissidents, hoping to find a following of their own in the working class, expressed pleasure in the fact that the workers did not heed the call of the party. Sartre was in Italy at the time, but he quickly returned to Paris and worked night and day on a series of articles in defense of the Communist Party. He later wrote, quote, "These sordid, childish tricks turned my stomach. There may have been more ignoble ones, but none more revealing. An anti-communist is a rat. I couldn't see any way past that and never will. After 10 years of ruminating, I had come to the breaking point and only needed that one straw. In the language of the church, this was my conversion." End quote. Sartre. In the series of articles titled "The Communist and Peace," Sartre allied himself unconditionally with the Communist Party of France. Sartre argued that the party is the necessary and exact expression of the working class. Quote, "The working class still recognizes itself in the forced trials which the party institutes in its name." Jesus Christ. To the non-communist left, he warned that destruction of the party would be a blow against the working class and humanity in general. Quote, "We cannot go against the working class without becoming the enemy of mankind and of oneself. ... And at all costs, we must not count on the liquidation of the Communist Party." End quote. Sartre. Thus, Sartre's conversion was unequivocal. For all intents and purposes, he had joined the party without taking out a membership card. Although he embraced the party on his own terms, he could not do so on its terms. Isolated as it was, the PCF was not in a position to quibble. The party accepted Sartre's support without asking him to endorse Stalinism, even though some of his now former friends, Camus, Merleau-Ponty, believed it was exactly what he was doing. Sartre averred. What year was this? I don't know what does he mean? Like what the hell does he mean as the party didn't ask him to endorse Stalinism. I don't know. It's like a very bizarre thing, like the philosophy of it. Like it's again, like that's what I'm saying. It's like there's like this thing like, there's definitely very much like this kind of like use of the word Stalinism to refer to just merely like a set of dogmatic philosophies, as opposed to like a system. Thus, Sartre's conversion was unequivocal. For all intents and purposes, he had joined the party without taking out a membership card. Where the hell? No, I already read that. The party accepted Sartre's support without asking him to endorse Stalinism, even though some of his now former friends, Camus, Merleau-Ponty, believed this was exactly what he was doing. Sartre averred, "It was a question of laying idealism to rest. Quote, to cease saying no to everything, to cease dreaming of a proletariat in absolute conformity with one's wishes, to cease hoping for an ideal communism born of a new proclamation to the working class and cleansed of Stalinism." End quote. Yeah, this is such a bullshit thing, because what if the working class is social democratic in character? Or not even left-wing at all? Should you just support whatever the working class supports at any given time? That's ridiculous. If like also like if the working class has support for the Stalinist system, that is most certainly by any actually meaningful critical any meaningful way like a misplaced enthusiasm, a misplaced hope. Anyway, for all its evils, the defeat of Stalinism would be, quote, primarily a defeat of the workers and only secondarily of Stalinism, end quote. In addition to the political consequences of the communists in peace, Sartre began to develop in this series of articles the historical and social categories of theory which he eventually set forth in the Critique of Dialectical Reason. The ahistorical framework of the book Being and Nothingness is discarded in favor of the historical conditioning of individual action. Quote, the historical whole determines our powers at any given moment. It prescribes their limits in our field of action and our real future. It conditions our attitude toward the possible and the impossible, the real and the imaginary, what is and what should be. End quote. History is granted its full weight, but within its limitations, the freedom of the individual to create oneself is preserved. The concept is given full elaboration in the Critique. Sartre also begins to develop his social categories. In analyzing the working class, he argues that the individual worker cannot achieve authentic freedom without the situation of his entire class being transformed. Yet serious social obstacles block the path of such a transformation, chief among them being the atomization of the working class itself. In the Critique, Sartre develops this insight into his latter concept of serialization. Fellow traveling with the Communist Party of France cost Sartre the friendship of Albert Camus and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Sartre interpreted Camus, the rebel, as denying any meaning to history and social commitment. He felt that Camus, philosopher of the absurd and former resistance activist, was advocating a retreat into art as an individual solution to the absurdity of human existence. In a review published in the Temps moderne, Sartre's protege, Francis Janson, sharply attacked these assertions. Sartre himself rebuked Camus. Quote, the problem is not to ask whether history makes sense or not, and whether we should deign to take part in it or not. We are in it up to our necks one way or the other. The problem is to try to give it the meaning which seems to us most right. It is idle to debate whether there are values which transcend history. If there are those which manifest themselves in what men do, in human actions. End quote. Sartre. Sartre distorted Camus' position, for Camus did not give up his social commitment. Even so, Sartre was able to reaffirm in a somewhat different context his principle that the meaning of human freedom is found in history and through social commitment. In 1945, Merleau-Ponty was much closer to the Marxism of the communists than Sartre. He even wrote a book in 1947 titled Humanism and Terror, defending the Soviet Union to the point of justifying Stalin's purge trials. As political editor of the Temps moderne, Merleau-Ponty tried to win Sartre closer to Marxism. Ironically, Sartre's political thought came closer to Marxism. His own drifted away. Sartre's, quote, conversion came just when Merleau-Ponty was having his most serious doubts. By the summer of 1953, it was obvious that they were moving in opposite political directions, so Merleau-Ponty found a pretext and resigned from the Temps moderne. In the book, The Adventures of the Dialectic of 1955, Ponty subjects Sartre's, quote, ultra-Bolshevism to a thorough critique. In intricate fashion, he took apart the book, The Communists in Peace, showing that at bottom it was built on the shaky foundations of an existentialist ontology sagging under the weight of Stalinist politics. That seems, I don't know actually the content of the book, but that's precisely what I'm talking about. I think this is an interesting, this is kind of like what I'm kind of like getting at a lot of these things I'm reading about France, is like this notion, this like Stalinism minus with like more sophisticated and open, like, philosophical foundations, with a Stalinist politics on top of it. And like I feel like this is like a thing where it's like you could say the same thing with like Althusser, right? Althusser is like drawing on things outside of the Marxist canon, or the Marxist-Leninist canon, the Stalinist canon, but is fundamentally committed to the politics of that. Fundamentally committed to the politics of Stalinism, and or like Stalinism as a system. Anyway. Although there were several polemical rebuttals forthcoming, Sartre took the criticism seriously and incorporated much of it into his later critique. From 1952 to 1956, Sartre marched side by side with the Communist Party of France. Occasionally, disagreements did not mar the real friendship Occasional disagreements did not mar the real friendship that developed. Sartre and Jacques Duclos shared the speaker's platform at public meetings. The Humanité, the PCF newspaper, reported favorably on Sartre's activities and writings. Sartre, on his part, joined the Soviet-led World Peace Movement, spoke at the Vienna World Congress for Peace, November 1952, reported favorably on his visit to the Soviet Union, became an officer of the Franco-Soviet Friendship Association, and forbade a revival of his play Dirty Hands because of the bad memories it recalled. This honeymoon lasted until the 1956 invasion of Hungary. An article published in L'Express, Sartre condemned the invasion. Quote, "From every point of view, the intervention was a crime. It is an abject lie to pretend that the workers are fighting side by side with Soviet troops. The Red Army opened fire on an entire nation." End quote. Sartre. New section. Section 5. Sartre and the origins of the French New Left. The Hungarian invasion brought out an important change for Sartre. Sartre broke completely with his communist friends and the Stalinist view, which assumed the Soviet Union was the only hope in the world for progressive change. In the book, The Ghost of Stalin, 1956, Sartre sought to uncover the reasons for the invasion in a socio-historical analysis of Soviet and East European socialism, but more importantly, he sought to analyze the political potential in France of the Communist Party of France. Quote, "Consider this monstrous party which blocks and freezes 5 million voices, demobilizes the working class, abandons the interests of the masses for parliamentary maneuvers, lightly denounces Algeria in order to threaten the socialists, quite in vain, but at the same time does not hesitate to rationalize its contempt with stupid declarations about the situation in Hungary. Alliance of the Communist Party as it is and intends to remain can have no other effect than compromising our last chances for a common front." End quote. Sartre. With the socialists condoning torture and massacre in Algeria and the communists applauding the Soviet intervention, Sartre could only conclude that the plight of the established left in France was hopeless. While this was no cause for joy, it nevertheless freed Sartre to take the political and theoretical initiative to revitalize Marxism. His effective protest against the Algerian War in the late 1950s and early 1960s earned him the disrespect of the... His effective protest against the Algerian War in the late 1950s and early 1960s earned him the respect of the disrespectful youth, and almost got him killed by the OAS, which is like a far-right, kind of paramilitary organization, to my understanding. Thus, the emerging New Left student movement began to look to Le Temps Moderne and Sartre for political and theoretical direction. The break with the Old Left also freed Sartre to pursue an independent approach to Marxism. The theoretical advances had been very uneven and undeveloped. Freed from his pro-Stalinist political practice and PCF frame of reference, he was able to develop his systematic synthesis of Marxism and existentialism that was so crucial to New Left social theory, the Critique de la Raison Dialectique, Critique of Dialectical Reason. And that's the end of the actual chapter. Now I'm going to look at the footnotes, see if there's anything that's worthwhile. Footnote. French existentialism is, of course, a broad intellectual movement representing all sorts of political and cultural views, while Sartre is an atheistic leftist. Gabriel Marcel, for example, is a religious rightist. Due to the nature of this study, we will only be concerned with the existentialist left. 3. the piece On a raison de se révolter, in the conversations presented in this volume with two French New Leftists, Philippe Gavi and Pierre Victor, Sartre gives us his self-interpretation of his political development. See also Michel-Antoine Bernier's Choice of Action, translated by B. Merchland, 1968, and Rosanna Rosanda's article, Sartre's Political Practice, published in Socialist Register in 1975, for sympathetic accounts of his political activity. Section 4, new footnote 4. Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre's lifelong companion, recounts these and other events in Sartre's life during the 1930s in the book The Prime of Life, translated by R. Howard in 1960. This is the second volume of her 4 volumes of autobiographical memoirs. It covers the period 1929 to 1944 and is one of the best available sources for biographical material on Sartre for this period. The best actual biography is Francis Janson's Sartre dans sa vie. Footnote, quote, any study of human reality must begin with the cogito, end quote, Sartre. Footnote, here is where the difference of Husserl and Heidegger is evident. An excellent study of the impact of these two on Sartre is Ronald Aronson's article, Interpreting Husserl and Heidegger, the Root of Sartre's Thought. Footnote, many of his examples of social relations are drawn from disquieting, disturbing, or even deviant situations. E.g., a man is caught peeping through a keyhole and feels shame when confronted with the, quote, look of the other, end quote. On the other, Marxists tend to view social relations as rooted in relations of production and class conflict, allowing for positive social relations within the working class. Thus, they tend to be more optimistic than the early Sartre, who perceived individual conflict as the essence of all social relations. Footnote, see Sartre, No Exit, and 3 other plays. Footnote, Sartre wrote this article in response to a request from the editors of Action, a communist resistance journal, who asked him to clarify his views and their relation to Marxism. See, for example, see Roger Garaudy's Literature of the Graveyard, translated by J. Burstein in 1948. Footnote, in an interesting section on the history of the philosophies group, of which he was a member, Lefebvre claimed that he had discovered existentialism in the 1920s, long before Sartre. In 1946, he considered it an immature stage of adolescent rebellion on his way toward the, quote, mature thought of Marxism. Footnote, Georges Lucas's Existentialism ou Marxisme, which I guess is existentialism or Marxism, of 1948, was also important in the French debate because of his international stature as the world's most distinguished communist intellectual. End footnote. Footnote, Lefebvre, for his part, characterized Sartre's thought as the, quote, magic and metaphysics of shit, end quote. That's so good. And called his novel Nausea, the manifesto of the pederast. Not that I agree with these, but these are good words here. And footnote. Even Merleau-Ponty, a friend and fellow existentialist, criticized Sartre for concentrating too much on extreme situations and not taking into account the quote interworld of relations. See Merleau-Ponty's book Phenomenology of Perception of 1945. Footnote. The article or the lecture, Existentialism, is it Humanism, is the lecture in which Sartre gave the now classical definition of existentialism as the philosophy in which, quote, existence precedes essence, and quote. And footnote. While Sartre did not consciously limit his study to the male sex, end footnote. While Sartre did not consciously limit his study to the male sex, de Beauvoir was one of the first theorists to note that the use of masculine terms to refer to all human beings reflected a deeply ingrained unconscious assumption that, quote, humanity is male, and quote, and that women are somehow less as human beings. In this book, I have generally attempted to avoid such usage except where necessary for a faithful rendering of a particular theorist's work. For a history of feminism, see Sheila Rowbotham, Women, Resistance, and Revolution, 1972. After the Popular Front, the socialists of the SFIO, Section Française Internationale Ouvrière, were seriously compromised. One commentator claims, quote, the SFIO had no appeal for a radical intellectual, end quote. Footnote, Sartre got his information from the battlefield reporting of I.F. Stone. I'm assuming that's about the Korean War. I believe I.F. Stone was kind of like a left social democrat, or like left socialist. In my mind, he's like part of like the Dissent journal, like founded by Irving Howe, but I'm not exactly sure. Let's see, sorry. As François Janson put it, quote, our point of reference is the impotence of the left, end quote. And that's from Let Jean-Paul Sartre. And footnote, the Temps moderne was seized by the government 4 times during the Algerian War for exposing the widespread use of torture and urging French army draftees to insubordination and desertion. Sartre and de Beauvoir were threatened with prison for protecting and aiding the, quote, Janson network of anti-war agitators. During the Algerian War, Sartre helped up Paul Nizan to the youth of France as embodying the spirit of revolt. Quote, his life was exemplary because it was an outrage, end quote. Sartre. Okay, and that is the end of Chapter 2 of The French New Left and Intellectual History, from Sartre to Gorz. This is by Arthur Hirsh. The next chapter is titled Sartre's Critique of Marxism. Thank you so much for listening.